Hello, everybody. Welcome to our very special History Council annual event, the presentation of our annual lecture and of our two major prizes. I'm Stephanie Holt. I'm the Executive Officer at the History Council. And of course, we would like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which we meet tonight. We acknowledge and pay respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Straits Islander people and their elders, past and present, as the custodians of the world's oldest continuous living culture. I'm now going to hand over to the Chair of the History Council, Professor Peter McPhee, to take you through the proceedings.
Well, Stephanie, thank you so much, and it's lovely to see you all here. So the History Council of Victoria is the peak body for history in this state, with our objective of furthering historical literacy and awareness and inspiring public engagement with the past and the world today. We're interested in the history of all places and all periods. The council includes representatives from cultural and educational institutions and heritage bodies, history teachers, academic and professional historians, and specialist history organisations. Before I introduce this evening's lecturer, we have the pleasure of awarding the History Council's two major prizes. First, I'm announcing the joint winners of the Jane Hansen Prize for History Advocacy for 2024. This was a prize established by Jane Hansen in 2020 to recognise the efforts of a group or an individual who's advocated for the value of history, the work of historians, and the importance of an education in history. So the winners are the Care Leavers Australasia Network, or CLAN. CLAN is an independent peak membership body established in 2000 to provide support, advocacy, research and empowerment for survivors of past abuse and neglect in child welfare systems in Australia and New Zealand. CLAN has shown extraordinary leadership in advocating for a more authentic, layered and nuanced history, and in doing so has generated vitality to a previously neglected field of public history. In the aftermath of the Royal Commission, CLAN won a Commonwealth grant to purchase a permanent home for the Australian Orphanage Museum, now established in Ryrie Street, Geelong. This unique museum is a remarkable achievement in CLAN's contributions to the way history is presented and received in the community.
Congratulations, mate. Yeah. Say a few words. Thank you very much, Peter. We're very, very honoured to receive this award. We recognise how important history is. We've been at it for over 20 years, 25 years perhaps. Leonie Sheedy, the CEO and the founder of, or co-founder of CLAN, is with us tonight, and she should really be up here. It's been a team effort of a group of people whose history has been ignored and overlooked or distorted in many ways, and we've tried to set the record straight over the last 25 years. So we're very, very pleased and honoured to be here tonight receiving this award, and congratulations also to the equal winner.
Thank you. Thanks, Ray. So the joint winner of the Jane Hansen Prize is Dr. David Waldron from Federation University in Ballarat. David has been a tireless advocate for public history for many years, with a commitment to making history accessible and engaging for diverse audiences. Over the past decade, he's led a dynamic range of projects, community collaborations, and public engagement initiatives in Ballarat and its region. These efforts underscore his leadership in bringing marginalised histories to contemporary audiences as well, including working with Wadawurrung traditional owners and those in the LGBTQIQA+ community. David has a remarkable ability to communicate to diverse audiences. He's an active history podcaster and a regular presenter about history at festivals and on community radio. Congratulations, David.
Congratulations, of course, also to my co-winner, Frank. I'd like to particularly thank my Tales from Rat City team, the umbrella in which we do our community organisations, Katrina Hill and Shannon Nichols and to my family and to my colleagues at Federation University. And I'd just like to mention in passing, a few years back, we had a conversation with much further up the food chain at Fed Uni than I am. And they said they didn't think there was a future for history at Federation University, as they argued it couldn't be co-opted. There wasn't a role for it in community and industry engagement. And I've made it my mission to show that this is not the case, and have built long-lasting and really successful collaborations out with the community. And, you know, particularly thinking, you know, the great work we've done, which I should also thank as well, Shannon Menon and the Waldron Traditional Owner Aboriginal Corporation, that, you know, this is not the case. We are deeply immersed in our communities, with our industries, with our collaborative partners. And there's I think, a really deep need and hunger to engage with our past and all of our past from all our different diverse perspectives. So thank you very much, and I'm deeply honoured.
I've been a little involved in that review process at Federation University, and everything that David said is right. And he's played a crucial role in rejuvenating, if you like, the arts program. We also have joint winners of the Lynette Russell Prize for First Peoples History in Schools. This was a prize established in 2021 by Lynette Russell, Sir John Monash Distinguished Professor at Monash University, to encourage the creative engagement and deeper knowledge of a wider number of primary and secondary school students in this foundational area. And to announce these awards, I want to invite Tara Oldfield to the stage. Tara is the Deputy Chair. Come on up, Tara. Deputy Chair of the History Council, works at the Public Records Office of Victoria, and she's going to announce the winners of this prize.
Thanks, Peter. The first winner, it's my pleasure to announce. Yes, thank you. Briar Hill Primary School. Students from prep to grade 6 at Briar Hill have spent time observing their local environment to learn about the Wurundjeri seasons and developing an appreciation of the deep knowledge, wisdom and connection that First Nations people have to their land and their expertise for caring for our environment. Students have connected with local elders. Younger students have created handcrafted items out of beeswax, wool and clay that represent elements from the Wurundjeri seasons, while grades 5 and 6 created maps of the Kulin Nations and investigated traditional land care practices such as the burning off season. Well done, Briar Hill, and I think we have Leila Smith here to accept the award.
Thank you so much. I think you outlined what we've done beautifully. Thank you. So on behalf of Briar Hill Primary School, just want to say thank you so much. I'm so excited to show our students what they've achieved. So thank you. I appreciate that.
And the next winner, Clifton Hill Primary School. Had a few hills. The school has been liaising with its Aboriginal families, completing Koori education plans for Aboriginal students, and is in the initial stages of developing a school reconciliation plan through the Narragansett framework. For many years, the school has had a curriculum that teaches First Nations histories. Leadership and staff promote the importance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and culture throughout every aspect of the education program. Congratulations, Clifton Hill, represented by Kate Denborough. Well done.
I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and who are the traditional owners of where we are fortunate to be tonight, and pay my deep respect to their elders, past and present. Thank you very much to the History Council and to Peter and everyone involved. It was an enormous surprise for us. I'm very grateful, and really encourages our community and our parents to keep trying to teach Australian history properly, tell the truth, make sure our children and our grandchildren's children know the value and the strength and the richness of Aboriginal culture, and to keep reminding always was, always will be. So thank you very much for this wonderful award.
Thanks, Peter.
And I should add that I've been in touch with both Jane Hansen and Lynette Russell and forwarded them the citations. Neither of them could come, unfortunately, had other things on, but they were absolutely thrilled with the the range and the quality of the historical activities that were being recognised this evening. So now to our 21st annual lecture from Professor Katie Holmes. Katie is Professor of History and Director of the Centre for the Study of the Inland at La Trobe University. Her work integrates environmental, gender, oral and cultural history, and she has a particular interest in the interplay between individuals, their cultures and their environments. Her books include Spaces in Her Day, Women's Diaries of the 1920s and 1930s, Between the Leaves, Stories of Women Writing in Gardens, and a number of co-authored books, Reading the Garden, The Settlement of Australia, then Mallee Country, Land, People and History, and recently Failed Ambitions, Kew Cottages and Changing Ideas of Intellectual Disability. Katie is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences of Australia and was very recently the Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser Visiting Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University in 2023-2024. Her recent research is on the cultures of drought in regional Victoria and water cultures and conflicts in the Murray Darling Basin. And it's from that work that she's delivering this evening's lecture, Drought, Flooding Rains and Futures, Environmental History in the Murray Darling Basin. Please welcome Katie.
Very much, Peter, and thank you all for coming out this evening. It's a real honour to be here, and I'm honoured at your attendance as well. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we are meeting on, the land and the waters, and pay my respects to the Wurundjeri and Wurrung people. I'd also like to acknowledge the 50 First Nations whose land and waters lie within the Murray Darling Basin. And before I finish on the thanks, my thanks also to Drs. Margaret Cook and Karen Twigg, who have conducted the interviews on which tonight's lecture is based, or that I'm drawing on for tonight's lecture. My thanks to the interviewees who've given up their time and their thought and their ideas, and also to the many people whose ideas have contributed to this, my thinking about the basin and the conflicts and communities that make up the region. Research for this lecture has been supported by the Australian Research Council, the Australian Government Murray Darling Basin Water and Environmental Research Program, and the Murray Darling Basin Authority's Basin Condition Monitoring Program. In 2017, Alice Davey, a former dairy farmer and now landowner at Gunbar in Victoria's north, just downstream from Echuca, donned a high-vis jacket and stood in the Kahuna irrigation channel. The channel was full of native wildlife, fish, birds, yabbies, turtles. But in the drive for efficiency, water catchment authorities were lining the large channels with plastic to stop water seepage. Alice recalled, "The whole channel was completely dug out and lined. They didn't relocate anything, and we lost all of that biodiversity. It was just heartbreaking. I kicked up a really big stink. I put on a day-glow high-vis jacket and I stood there until somebody noticed me. I said, 'Look, you see that? A turtle there, a turtle there, a turtle there. Are you going to relocate them?' I got ordered off the site." But it wasn't only the turtles that were affected by the channel. Other native wildlife were also affected. 12 metres of trees either side of the channel were also cleared. Alice reflected, "You don't see the water birds anymore. You might see an occasional pied cormorant, but you don't see the darters or all the black cormorants. There might be fish in the channel, but there's nothing else." Alice's story is a distressing example of the ways in which the imperatives of efficient water management come up against a more relational understanding of water, which treasures waterways for the home and refuge they provide to an array of non-human species. Her story also reveals the passionate engagement many who live in the Murray Darling Basin feel towards the waterways that surround their homes and farms, and the creatures to whom those waters give life. There are many stories from the Murray Darling Basin which highlight different kinds of slow and fast violence, which together have brought dramatic changes to the region's ecosystems. But in our current cultural, political, and environmental context, are these the stories we should choose to tell? At the heart of our current environmental and biodiversity crisis is a problem with human relationships with the natural world. Interrogating that relationship lies at the heart of environmental history. A key development in environmental history and environmental humanities recently has been to the more than human approach, an approach which gives primacy to the diversity of biosocial relationships, a world co-created by animals, plants, fungi, humans, air, water, and more. Emily O'Gorman's recent book, Wetlands in a Dry Land, for example, is a beautiful study of the co-creation of wetlands across the Murray Darling. This turn to the more than human has been driven in part by thinking about the kinds of stories we need for a flourishing, regenerative Earth. The American essayist Rebecca Solnit writes, "The stories we tell about who and what we were, what we did, shape what we can and will do. We need histories that speak for both the humans and the non-human, of caring for country, of stewardship, cultivating, healing, restoring. Stories about the complex entanglements of the more than human world, and stories infused with the values which must guide our stewardship and our relationship with it. What are the histories that can move us forward?" Well, given how much we hear about conflict and environmental crisis in relation to the Murray Darling Basin, I've decided that in this lecture, I want to foreground other kinds of stories. Stories which talk of people's entanglement with their local places, the battles they've fought for them, and the grief they too often feel. These stories also often speak for the fish, the birds, the trees, the wetlands. They flow from a range of recent research, including 2 oral history projects commissioned by the Murray Darling Basin Authority through the Centre for the Study of the Inland at La Trobe, in which we interviewed long-term residents of 9 basin communities about living with environmental change. And we've undertaken about 120 interviews all up. The ones I'm going to be drawing from today are about 60 of those. 2 other Australian Research Council projects, one on drought in regional Victoria and one on water cultures in the Murray Darling Basin, have also fed into this research and influenced my thinking. To bring together the human and the non-human stories of river communities, I want to introduce you to the 19th century term riverhood, meaning the state of being a river. The idea of riverhood has been picked up by some geographers and political scientists as a way of thinking about environmental justice and rivers and the rights of rivers in the sense of personhood. It's also a way of thinking about the different kinds of relationships that humans, animals, and plants might have with rivers and waterways, in the way that neighbourhood evokes a community of different kinds of relationships. Further than this, riverhood centres communal relationships and possible responses. And this is the way that I'm going to be using the concept in this lecture. Riverhood offers us an alternative to the dominant discourse within the Murray Darling Basin of water as a resource and help shift our focus from conflict to community. But first, where and what is the Murray Darling Basin? Once I've introduced you to it, I'll give a brief overview of key environmental changes before moving on to discuss some of the main stories or the main storylines to emerge from our interviews. If I can just get this to work. There we go. The layers of sediment are ancient in the Murray Darling Basin. Its main rivers are estimated to be 65 million years old. On the world's driest inhabited continent, the network of rivers that we now call the Murray Darling Basin are the lifeblood of the southeast, creating the food bowl of the nation, generating approximately $24 billion of agricultural produce each year. The rivers and floodplains of the northern basin flow into the Darling or the Barker River, as it is known to the traditional owners, the Barkindji. The Barker is a boom-bust river. It floods with tropical rainstorms or cyclones, its waters spreading across vast floodplains. The Murray draws its waters from the mountains of the Great Dividing Range and is more consistent than the Darling, but it too is known for its cycles of droughts and floods. The basin is large, approximately 1 million square kilometres, including most of New South Wales, all of the ACT, much of Victoria, and some of South Australia and Queensland. It's home to about 2.3 million people, including 50 First Nations communities. Most people distinguish between the northern and the southern basin, but even this elides the diverse and complex histories and ecologies across the region. The basin is layered with ancient stories. Aboriginal dreaming stories link First Nations existence and the geography of their lands to the river system and the fish, vegetation and birds that depend upon them. Daniel Flakula, a Waka Waka and Walewan woman from the Macquarie Marshes in New South Wales, tells the creation story of the marshes, which were made from the Barwon River. That's the Barwon in New South Wales, not the Barwon in Victoria. She tells the story. A giant tree was home to a dominant and aggressive wedge-tailed eagle. The Walewan people and some animals started a fire in the tree to get rid of the eagle. They burnt it out and the tree crashed to the ground. The tree fell from the Barwon end, its branches forming the creeks and channels of the marshes, the trunk marking the passage of the Macquarie River through the middle. For the Narrandjeri in South Australia, the river and the landscape through which it flowed was shaped by the great ancestral being, Narundari, who chased Pondi, the Murray cod, down the river. Narundari threw his spear at Pondi many times. Each time it escaped him. As Pondi rushed forward, his twisting and turning created the numerous bends in the Murray River. Prior to colonisation, Aboriginal people manipulated and used the river environment in a variety of ways. They fished and ate plants growing in the river. They burned grasses and hedges systematically around bodies of water. They constructed fish traps. The Nunu fish traps at Briar in northwest New South Wales are thought to be at least 1,000 years old. The rivers sustained complex relationships between place and people. For settler Australians, the Murray Darling Basin has been the inspiration for some of our most recognisable cultural expression. Banjo Patterson's Clancy of the Overflow was at home in the Murray Darling. Pijunet's Flood on the Darling captures the extraordinary expanse of the Darling floodplain. A Breakaway by Tom Roberts depicts the drought-ravaged landscape of southern New South Wales. The rivers carry the names of white nation building, Lachlan, Macquarie, Darling, the Murray itself, named after a British soldier turned colonial secretary. It's impossible to work in the basin and not be confronted by the rapid environmental changes that residents have experienced and enabled, and the highly contested nature of water politics. The dominant understanding of water that settlers brought to this country was water as a resource to be used and not wasted. Wasted water was unproductive water. Another view of water that developed in the early 20th century is its role in creating a wonderland of birds and fish and trees, a vulnerable, delicate world that needed protection. These different ways of valuing water still underpin key responses to and conflicts around use of water in the basin. Water has an economic value, it has an environmental value. For First Nations, water is also kin. It is culture and life. So colonisation brought rapid environmental change to the rivers. Their extreme variability was a surprise and challenge to Europeans who thought the slow flowing were lazy, an early indication that rivers were expected to work, to be productive.
Oh, did you? Okay. Hi, Monica. Maybe she'll know.
Grazing animals degraded banks and cleared vegetation. Rivers were channeled for transport. Stands of river red gums were cleared to fuel first the steamers.
Oh, here's one it might be.
And then for the railway sleepers when trains replaced water transport.
There's one.
Some estimate that around 20 billion trees have been removed from the basin to European settlement.
That's it. Thank you.
Mining activities in the 19th century introduced vast amounts of sediment into the river channels. The sand slug that is narrowing what is now called the Barmah Choke but which Yorta Yorta and earlier settlers called the Narrows, very interesting difference between those two words. That sand slug can be traced back to sand and soil washed into the river system from mining activity in the late 19th and early 20th century. While settler activity was laying sediment on the river floors, dryland farming and early irrigation was drawing salt from the ancient subsoil to the surface. Changes to rivers gathered pace in the 20th century, with attempts to control flows, particularly the Murray. The most significant and autumn to better meet the needs of agriculture. Throughout the history of settler engagement with the basin, the problem with water has been framed as one of environmental lack, rather than one of settler demand. And technological solutions have been framed as the answer to settler problems with water scarcity. The system now has 110 major dams, numerous locks, 500 weirs on the main river stems, plus many smaller ones on tributaries, as well as 5 coastal barrages. The net effect of all this hydroengineering has been to transform a river system characterised by highly variable flows into a controlled waterscape. It is also a heavily irrigated landscape, one of the most technologically advanced in the world. The region could not be a food bowl without irrigation. Throughout the 20th century, irrigation was regarded as a nation-building activity, critical to the economic development of the country. The Chaffey Brothers schemes and soldier settlement schemes were to further white settlement of inland Australia and turn the inland fields into an expanse of agricultural production. The growing of rice, fruit, nuts, dairy, all depended and still depends on irrigation. In addition, the addition of cotton to this list came with large state government water subsidies in the Northern Basin and big money from American investors in the relatively wet decades of the 1960s and 70s. The opening of Clifton Dam in 1976 near Narrabri in New South Wales meant that cotton farms began to replace livestock farms, or, as Douglas Allen from Moree explains, they swapped an economy based on grazing to an economy based on water. For nearly the whole of the 20th century, government policy encouraged water use, and the amount of water irrigators could use was unregulated. It was there and theirs for the taking. Sick rivers were the consequence. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the health of rivers in the Murray Darling Basin was headline news. By 2006, 2007, at the height of the millennium drought, the rivers were in crisis. In some rivers, the annual flows were 40% below previous low records. This wasn't just a result of lack of rainfall, but of increased extraction, death by 1,000 sucks, as ecologist Nick Bond and his co-authors called it. The severity of the drought led what was then the Murray Darling Basin Commission to cut water allocations to irrigators by up to 65%. Farmers still talk about this moment and its devastating impact on their crops and their mental health. 2 other critical developments of the late 20th century would have significant environmental and social impact. The first was the separation of land and water. From 1994, you could own land but sell the water that came with it. This in turn led to the second key development, the growth of a water market where water can be traded to the highest bidder, irrespective of whether they actually own land or use water for agricultural production, very much like shares on a stock market. The influence of neoliberal economics on government water policy is stark. Water, what Roman Krasnick calls a common treasury, became privately owned and subject to neoliberal imperatives of efficiency and economic outcomes. The government began buying water in 2004, and at the height of the Millennium Drought in 2007, formalised this process through the Water Act. The Water Act marked a radical change in government water policy. Water was no longer just there for the taking, and the environment would now be allocated a share of the basin's lifeblood. It's really hard to overemphasise the significance of these developments and their material impact on basin communities and the rivers and wetlands. The government buyback of water, buying water back from farmers at a set price, and the use of it for environmental purposes, now known as environmental water or e-water, remains highly contentious within the basin. Many argue that when water is scarce, people are more important than trees. Others stress that too often the water is released at the wrong time and in volumes too large for rivers to adequately carry, increasing bank erosion. There's also disagreement between scientists and locals about the timing and duration of forest flooding. Through all these processes I've been outlining, water has been increasingly imagined and managed in a way that dislocates it from its ecological context. This is the water of hydrologists, engineers, and government agencies, what geographer Jamie Linton terms modern water. It's not the water of Indigenous knowledge or culture and human relations. It is water that is atomised, commodified, metered, amenable to being allocated to different parties or users. In this understanding of water, rivers basically become a pipe to move water from one place to another. And the language of modern water is really striking. We have a watering event, think rain, a cease to flow event, think drought, an overflow event, unregulated flow, regulated flow, environmental water, wastewater, and the list goes on and on. In modern water, water and the rivers that carry it are stripped of their spiritual, cultural, and ecological relationships, the essence of their riverhood. These changes have also come during a period of major environmental crises, namely the Millennium Drought, the most recent drought of 2017-2020, and major flooding in 2011 and 2022. There is no agreement across the basin about the role of climate change in driving these devastating events. The boom and bust cycle of the basin can make it difficult to distinguish just how much anthropogenic global warming has added to the climatic extremes. But in the first 20 years of this century, there had been a 51% decrease in average annual flows into the river system compared with the previous 100 years. So this century has so far been a period of enormous environmental, economic, and social change in the basin. Unsurprisingly, the dramatic nature of these changes and the sense from some that the government and indeed the broader Australian community has turned its back on a previously favoured industry has left many angry, grieving, and dismayed. Emotions run high. The people we spoke with have captured the significant human cost of these crises and changes and reflected on their impacts on the places that they know and love. In turning to the interviews, I want now to look at the kinds of stories that people tell as they relate some of the experiences of living with environmental change. In using the theme of riverhood, I aim to highlight people's connections with waterways, shifting the narrative from water as a mere resource to diverse ways of understanding rivers and waterscapes. This focus also reveals other riverhoods, recognising that humans aren't the only species making community within the waterscapes of the Murray Darling Basin. For First Nations communities, recent environmental change comes on top of generations of living with the impacts of colonialism and the environmental revolution it initiated and fortified. Margaret Cook's interview with Barkindji man Jason Ford took place on the Darling Barker River at Briar, overlooking the fish traps. He observed, "It's a special place, this here, what you're looking at, Margaret. It's a place that's still here after all the interference, and there's still that evidence of what our people did. It's an amazing site, and it's a really old site too. but the changes in the river were significant. Quote, when I was younger, the water was clean, it was flowing, it was different. The fishing was different. You had yellowbelly, plenty of yellowbelly. You catch black bream, you catch the cod. But the yellowbelly had gone. Water was being extracted from these billabongs and small creeks, and they don't function anymore. Those tributaries are important habitat and need water. We've got to be careful how we treat water because that's a living entity, that's alive, and we're treating it disgustingly, Jason said. And that looks after us. We're nothing without that water. Such changes were not only about environmental degradation, they were also about loss of knowledge. Jason's mother sat by the river every day for 70 years. If the yellowbelly ceased to inhabit the river, it wasn't just the fish that were lost, but the knowledge of them. Quote, you can't share it because it's been interrupted. Aboriginal culture is centred on intergenerational relationships with country. As Jason notes, that knowledge conveys how to look after people and country. Knowledge that has, quote, been carried for thousands of years cannot be passed on. Skills cannot be learnt because the fish or shrimp or the water are not there to teach with. Country cannot be properly cared for. Relationships with fish, plants, birds, rivers are broken. These relationships are integral to cultural identity, so their loss threatens the health of First Nations river communities. For Jason Ford and other First Nations, the decline of the river is against cultural law. Quote, that's why my mother, she cries when she sees this. She loves this, but when the water was dry downstream where she goes fishing, she just cried. She said, I think it's over, son. It's all taken. Jason Wilson is a Kamilaroi man from Walgett. He also grew up fishing. His river is the Namoy. Quote, back in the day, it was a pristine system. As a kid, you could see the bottom of the place. You'd see catfish nets and you'd do a bit of spinning and a bit of wobbling. I fished the Namoy all my life, and I've seen it go from this beautiful little fishery to being clogged up. The water holes aren't in it anymore. It's super turbid and I wouldn't fish in it. One of the causes of such turbidity is carp, the rabbits of the river. For Jason, carp are more than just an introduced pest. They're, quote, the biggest killer of our culture. It's killing our culture. It's genocidal. It's no different from how they've taken the land. This carp has moved in and taken the fish's land. That's our people, those fellas. We have association with them. We have the ability to manage them. We don't have that anymore. Jason's reference to genocide is telling. Deborah Bird Rose suggests that extinction is a settler colonial legacy of both genocide and ecocide. Jason Wilson and Jason Ford capture some of the essence of riverhood for their people. Their relationships with the non-human communities of the river underpin their individual and collective well-being. Country is kin, relative. Ecological decline and loss alters the relationships they can have with country and breaks knowledge and traditions passed down over thousands of years. This loss of knowledge threatens culture. Not all the stories of environmental change carry such disturbing implications. For some settler communities, periods of environmental crisis can be times of learning. As devastating as droughts can be, many people in both irrigation and dryland farming communities talk about the way droughts have forced them to change their farming practices for the better. Josie is a dairy farmer from Kahuna and comes from a family which has been farming in the area since the early days of white settlement. Josie notes that the area is an ancient seabed. Intense irrigation of the area of the kind practiced by her forebeds led to problems with salinity. Putting too much water on soil raises the water table, drawing that ancient salt to the surface. In some areas, the soil became as salty as the sea. You have scalded white soil, she said. When it's at rock bottom, you can't get anything to grow. By the 1980s, the area had a major problem. A concentrated effort of education, introducing better drainage systems, laser grading the land so water would run off it quickly and not pool, tree planting, were all strategies at play. And then came the drought. Josie reflected, the millennium drought was probably the best thing for the salinity. Out of adversity comes opportunity. Water allocations were down, so people didn't put as much water on, and we changed our practices from having predominantly permanent pastures to annuals. We were probably cowboys with water because it wasn't valued. It was so available, it didn't cost us a lot. Marilyn, also from Kahuna, reinforced this narrative of the millennium drought, which, along with water trading rules, meant that the amount of water that used to be was reduced by at least a third, probably more. She notes, it's the best good news story that's never told. Such stories should not detract from the extraordinary pressures people live with during droughts. Many interviewees talked to us about this stress. For dryland farmers, drought has been part of the farming experience for as long as settlers have been growing crops and raising livestock. But for irrigation communities in the southern basin, previous droughts had hardly had an impact, and it wasn't until the millennium drought that they faced water restrictions and exorbitantly high water prices. Decisions about what to save and what to sacrifice permeate people's memories. The grief of sacrificing vines or fruit trees or a paddock you've nurtured for decades, but which can no longer be kept alive, are still present. This is not just an economic loss. It's about the devastation of an ecosystem you've helped create and which might also have kept you alive. For Josie, restricted water allocations aligned with low dairy prices and the global financial crisis. Quote, it all felt a bit like fucking Armageddon, really. I've got a video of us bulldozing trees down and taking out all the fences because the drought meant we couldn't water. I thought, this just feels like the whole world is ending. It was a heat wave. It was horrendous. That was probably one of the toughest days. And there's generational trauma from that. Generational trauma can mean that children who might once have returned to manage the family farm don't. Family traditions are broken, futures upended. The mental health strain also leaves its mark. One woman recalled returning home to find her husband had bulldozed their orchard, unable to cope anymore with the stress of trying to find money to buy the water to keep the trees alive. If droughts are seared into memory, so too is the breaking of them. Daniel Flakier from the Macquarie Marshes recalls the smell of rain. So when the rain comes, it gives you hope, and you can smell that. It's the smell of hope. It's a smell of reviving and renewing life again. It's a happy smell. In the marsh, it can be a smelly smell because of the bird breeding. That water brings life and is life, and it's so important for our life and the life of all species that depend on it. Rain brings a reminder of all the creatures that depend on that water, the riverhood connections. James Somerville from Murray talks about droughts breaking. When you've been months and months in drought, you'd have sleepless nights and big debts and think, where are we going to go? Then out of the blue, we'd see the birds circling, the rivers coming down. There's the roar of insects coming out of the ground. People's memories of drought-breaking rains reveal much about their connections to place and the non-human world. The celebration of life returning to waterways echoes through nearly all our interviews. Tanya Frost from Murray recalled, we had rain prior to the last flood. We had early rain and the lagoon had been dry for 3 years. It had been an awful time. When the rain came, the eastern long-necked turtles came out of who knows where, hundreds and hundreds of them, and they were coming from the channel. I couldn't believe it. It was just amazing where these creatures go and hide all the time. When the water comes, the birds seem to know ahead, and when a flood comes, the roar of frogs from the channel is deafening. It's just incredible. These memories speak of people's intense relationships with the places that they live and love, and their astute observance of the natural world. This place-based knowledge is critical, and life-saving, never more so than in times of flood. Josie from Kahuna talked about the importance of knowing which levee would protect them from rising waters and the need to look after it. It was generational knowledge handed down from her father-in-law. Knowledge connects people in place. When people leave, they take that knowledge with them. In the 2022 flood, it was a retired local weir keeper who recognised that the amount of water coming into the river system would overwhelm a badly damaged levee. He raised the alarm. The community responded by building a 19-kilometre long, 3-metre high levee, which saved the town from flooding. Josie reflected, "These old fellows, they know where the water goes because they've lived it. They've been the ones down sandbagging certain areas. They've actually lived it, so they don't need the modelling. The best lesson is the one you've lived." This knowledge is part of people's connections and relationships with their waterways, part of their riverhood. They know where the water goes. Such knowledge separates them from the city-based experts who don't share that intimate knowledge or lived experience. And it feeds into an intense rural passion whereby rural communities feel judged and misunderstood by city dwellers who have little idea of the kind of pressures that shape their daily lives. For some people, the connection to their rivers or waterways extends to fighting for their protection. Environmental justice is critical to the ways in which First Nations articulate their role as custodians of the rivers and waterways. We met Jason Milson earlier. He's the Camarillo man from Walgett and an Aboriginal leader in the water space. He reflected, "If water came into our country, we owned it. We managed it. We looked after it as it came in. We sung it coming in and we sung it going out. We celebrated it. We can't do that now because it gets stuck in our country, growing clothes for us." Jason evokes here the deep spiritual and cultural relationship his people have had with the river and the difference between this and an attitude which sees water as a way to make a profit. Jason's narrative speaks to the double dispossession of First Nations, the dispossession of colonisation followed by the water reforms which have compounded those losses. Jason sums this up. "The whole water thing is a circus. We used to own this circus, completely own this circus. Now we've got to pay to go to this circus, and it's sad. We can't change things unless government want to make a change and the irrigators accept that change." So that's where we're at with water. First Nations argue they have been excluded from decision-making about water. They have no ownership and no control. Environmental justice involves returning water and control. But in seeking this kind of redress and to gain a seat at the decision-making table, First Nations have been forced to engage in a system at odds with their water values and custodial responsibilities. Modern water is anathema to the understanding of water and all the life it enables as kin. Cultural flows is a concept that has been utilised to enable First Nations to participate in negotiations around water allocations. However, it pictures Indigenous people as one stakeholder among the many, and First Nations as competitors for access to water. Issues of environmental justice are not restricted to First Nations. For Sally Grundy and the people of the Goolwa district in the lower lakes of Murray in South Australia, the millennial drought was a disaster, not because of the lack of rain, but because so much water was being extracted out of the system upstream that the river stopped flowing. Sally lives on Mundu Island Station, the last farming property on the river system. The first sign of trouble came when their cattle refused to drink the water in the troughs. It was salty. The levels of fresh water in the river had dropped so low that the barrages built to stop the salt water entering the river leaked salt water through. Then the riverbed dried out completely, leaving a layer of acid sulfate soil, which when the wind blew filled the air with toxic dust, causing itchy eyes and rashes, but also landing on rooftops to be washed down into tanks which people were dependent upon for their water. Sally summed up her feelings about what had happened. The millennium drought was just a disgrace. it really was a disgrace that we were ever put in that position and that the river should ever be allowed to get to that state. The Lower Lakes and the Coorong are a Ramsar-listed wetland of international importance. Sally remains incredulous that an area of such ecological value could be allowed to suffer so much. The receding river led to the loss of habitat for critically endangered fish species, including Murray hardhead and southern pygmy perch. Sally and her family tried desperately to nurture 2 sites of this critical fish habitat. But as she recalled, as the water dried up, the foxes and the raptor birds, they would just come down and just pick the fish off because as the water got shallower and shallower, the fish had no chance at all to survive. Sally stresses the cause of this crisis. We were not in drought. There was water, but it was polluted water in terms of salinity, and then it dried up, and that wasn't due to drought. We still had rain. It was due to over-extraction of the river. We had 7 kilometres that we could drive on a dry riverbed. For those living at the end of the Murray River, the question of who gets access to the water is a critical one. Who has the most legitimate claim to it? Is this an issue of water rights? And if so, whose rights reign? It is an inherently a settler colonial framing whereby water is understood as a resource to be used. But Sally is also framing this as a critical environmental issue. Who speaks for the river, the fish, the turtles, the birds? The non-human communities of the river are invariably the silent victims of drought and extreme events, as the devastating series of fish kills at Menindee have repeatedly demonstrated. So how have people in river communities pushed back in defence of their rivers and wetlands? One striking aspect of our interviews has been the number of women who have emerged as leaders in their communities and as a voice for their waterways in the face of environmental crises. Sally Grundy, who I've just been quoting from, was, quote, catapulted into the limelight. She and her husband, quote, both had to lead from the front to try and make people see what was actually happening and get some action happening. She observes that in the midst of it all, it, quote, really made me personally look at the environment in a much more macro fashion. So I was looking for anything I could do to help the environment in this dire situation. You know, rescuing fish, rescuing turtles. She established a turtle rescuing program, teaching her children and the local school kids how to rehydrate them and clean their shells before taking them to a refuge place in Goolwa. Daniel Flakila realised she needed to speak up about the environmental, cultural and social impacts a reduced water flow from allocations was having on the marshes and her people. In order to be able to engage with the Murray Darling Basin Authority and negotiate flows and care of country, she needed to learn their lingo and that of the water management discourse. Quote, I started developing a position based on our cultural connections, but also reflecting on the natural and cultural values and speaking on behalf of nature and the river and challenging all of them, whether they were graziers or irrigators or water managers. It didn't make me popular, but I wasn't there for that. She explained that you need to have a lot of hope and you need to challenge the way things are done and not give up and just say, well, my hands are tied. It's actually no. You need to be that voice and advocate for the river and the waterways and just be presenting evidence. Most basin communities are well aware of the predictions that the basin's climate is becoming drier and more variable. The CSIRO conservatively predicting that by 2050, the Murray Darling Basin may experience a 5% reduction in average annual rainfall, leading to 20% less water in the system. Predictions for more extreme conditions have a 40% reduction of water in the system. Droughts could occur twice as frequently and floods be more extreme. The experience of the last 25 years has provided a foretaste of things to come. Concern for the future is acute. For First Nations interviewees, protecting their river is vital to continuing songlines and storylines, preserving knowledge and culture. realising the essential role that First Nations have in rehabilitating country, both through how they use it and how they care for it, is critical. For Daniel Flakier, people and country are entwined in her future thinking. We're planning for 7 generations down, not just the next ones, and that makes you think about country in a very different way. Also, it's not only about the river, it's all the natural world, the plants, the animals, the birds, everything, because I do worry about climate change. So we need to have a vision for a base of a sanctuary to help the natural world sustain itself. Her vision is to remove the dams and allow water to flow down naturally, coming back to the marsh from the Barwon, creating a vital and healthy riverhood community. Many interviewees expressed deep concern and regret about how divisive the politics of water had become. The heating, drying climate compounded this sense of distress around the fracturing of communities, with many recognising that working together was critical if people were to continue to get fed and the lungs of Australia were to last forever. But solutions had to be community-driven and most definitely not come from urban elites. Josie points out that private landholders occupy 86% of the North Central catchment management region. She views every irrigation channel as a micro-wetland and imagines engaging the landowners for environmental outcomes. Quote, maybe if they incentivise people to manage our own little hotspots, our own wildlife corridors, our own little wetlands. It just seems sensible that if they incentivise, teach us, guide us, you'll get your caretakers, you'll get your environmental outcomes, and we'll stay productive so we can actually feed people. There are many stories from the basin that highlight people's deep attachment to place, to the waterways they know and care about. The voice of the Maori irrigator who proposed moving the wetland so as to make way for a more efficient transfer of water was not echoed amongst many of our interviewees. Susan Miller told a story about a man called Howard who helped form the Murray Wetlands Working Group. At the end of each irrigation season, Howard would seek out irrigators who hadn't used their full water allocation and ask them to give it to him for environmental use. He would use the water to water a wetland. He describes doing a site near Wentworth, and I quote, the community suddenly realised what they had lost because when the wetland filled, all these frogs came and the noise, the sound of frogs singing, people went, remember, it used to be like that all the time? Remember how often we used to hear frogs? It was a really common thing. It just hadn't happened for years and years and years and years and years. Susan told the story as an illustration of how, quote, a community learnt what they'd lost. Recovering that history of that place helped infuse an understanding of both what was lost and a future to fight for. It exposed the impact of ignoring the ecological limits of place and the possibilities of restoration. The drive for efficiency that underpins modern water poses contradictory imperatives. While environmental water posits the environment as a worthy recipient of water, it becomes an entity that has to use it efficiently. The technocratic mechanisms by which modern water is managed don't recognise the embodied knowledge and relational values that communities have with their waterways. The idea of riverhood offers us a different way of recognising the relational nature of rivers and all they contribute to our well-being. Restoring that well-being will take compromise and sacrifice, and the question of who pays and in what kinds of ways is critical. If we are to enable the imaginative revolution and cultural transformation necessary to respond to the environmental and biodiversity crises that confront us, we have to understand the dynamic interrelationship between the environment and culture. In the Murray Darling Basin, the dominant settler cultural understanding and use of water is as a resource to be extracted for financial gain. I've chosen here to highlight other understandings. They're stories that tell of complex histories about place, identity, environment, settlement, family, and farming. Some seek to speak for the plants, bird, fish, forests, rivers. Often these stories are told by people who use water to irrigate their crops and make a living, but who also deeply value their waterways for their biodiversity and understand their critical role in a healthy river system. And they are people who are imagining different futures for their communities. We have to imagine the world we want to create. And it is not too late to imagine a basin of healthy waterways and thriving communities. Riverhood stories hold within them values to guide our relationship with the ecological world. In finding and cultivating such stories, environmental historians might become co-collaborators in imagining and working towards a basin where care, justice, and stewardship are the values that illuminate our path. Thank you.
That was a beautiful and very important lecture, Katie. Thank you so much. We do have a few moments for questions if people have them, or comments. Any takers? Alicia.
Katie, there's a mic, I think. Do we need mics?
Thank you. Okay. Katie, I was really struck by the way that you commented on the language that you saw, whether it was the contrast between the First Nations people and settler colonial people, or perhaps the people who were living on that river and working, making their lives on the river, compared to, say, more official government language. And firstly, I thought about oral history as a vehicle for this and how significant that would be. And also about, I wonder if you had a comment really on language and how that impacted what you were seeing in your work.
Well, as I suggested, one of the striking things about modern water is the language that it uses. And I guess one of the things that happens when that language becomes dominant, that kind of management language, that it is about codifying and classifying in ever tinier proportions of language, it kind of denies and elides the other kinds of relationships that I was trying to bring forward. And it has no place for the language of care, for example, or a more creative response. And environmental water, that term, and it's really interesting. When I was in the US, I was talking to the Americans about environmental water, and they were people who were used to the water space, and they were just completely bemused that you could have this thing called environmental water as if all water wasn't in some way environmental. So it sort of speaks to the way in which we've, as I say, codifying water in ever decreasing volumes. But what the oral histories do, as you say, is give us insight into other kinds of language and other kinds of ways of thinking about and valuing place. And they do talk about environmental water. And irrigators do talk about sustainable level of yield, which is another one of them. And that's a very managerial term. And those who farm as irrigators have to be able to speak that language, because they have to be able to engage with the authorities and the water management catchment authorities, because that's their language. But they also have other language, and that's what I was really fascinated to look for and to find, is that there are other ways of talking, and that show the kind of passion, I guess, that people have. And that passion is very much some of what I was trying to capture here. And it's that passion that is also completely stripped from modern water. And that's, I think, where you find the essence of riverhood.
Katie, what I find touching and moving in your presentation is the sense of a loss, a breaking of wholeness. And I sense in your interviews with the white settlers, a yearning, inchoate yearning perhaps, for finding that wholeness or building a new wholeness in some sense. Do you see any trace that this emotional reaction is laying the basis for some sort of significant change? Because to restore wholeness, you would have to pass through some way to address the breaking that the new system has brought.
Well, I think a lot of people think that the system is broken, that the Murray Darling Basin is at risk, and particularly in the Northern Basin on the Darling, the Darling River, is one of those ones that has really had deaths by 1,000 sucks. And one of the interesting things about the difference between the Northern Basin and the Southern Basin is that the Southern Basin is much more plumbed and much more regulated than the Northern Basin. So people feel that there is something wrong. Many people feel that there is something wrong, and that there's something needs to change in order for there to be a future that they can really look forward to, and that their families can look forward to, and their communities can. So I think that recognition of the breaking that you've picked up there, Chips, I think is a crucial point in the realization that something needs to change. And people talk about the things that need to change, and they talk about over extraction, and they talk about what that does to their precious places. And so in a sense, that's what I was trying to do, was to uncover these, somewhat more muted discourses, these more muted stories, because I think that's in finding them and telling them that we have ways of bringing to light and finding the connections between people, finding those passions, and also arguing that as the basin dries, the answer is not to actually give less water to the environment, which is a risk, because as the basin dries and there's less water, the pressure to use what is available to grow food and fibre will intensify. And that at the moment is also kind of where the power lies in the basin. So as the basin dries, if the environment is to be sustained, is to be able to live and thrive and flourish, then we need to magnify and intensify these voices that are recognizing that the healthy waterways bring not just a healthy environment, but they bring healthy people and healthy communities. And those are the stories that I've chosen to highlight, because they're there and because I think they are critical for a flourishing, regenerative world.
Thank you so much, Katie. You mentioned that in your interviews, which were wonderful, by the way. It was so good to hear the voices of the people living there. You mentioned that there were a lot of farmers who both use the water and draw on the water to feed people and to grow crops, but at the same time, they have a love of nature and they want to care for it. And I wondered if any of the people you spoke with were also, in their intentional efforts to care for nature, collaborating with First Nations people in their area.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And can I just, but as I answer it, I also wanted to say that I think it's really easy when we don't live in the basin to think about irrigators bad, or, and one of the things I really wanted to do was just say it's so much more complex than that. And it's too easy to pigeonhole people into particular positions. So I think there, in some areas, there are alliances, yes. And in some areas, it's a really good question. In some areas, I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And so, the basin is such a complex space, and the histories of colonization are also very different in the different areas. There are alliances, and I think they're really important ones to work on.
think we'll have to wrap it up there, but it's been a wonderful evening. And 20 years ago, the first of these lectures was given by Professor Graeme Davison from Monash University. And I've asked Graeme to come up and move a vote of thanks to Katie for a really superb lecture this evening. Thank you, Graeme.
Well, thank you, Peter, for reminding